Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back into the very popular and beloved Project Gotham franchise, once again to the latest in the franchise. And this is one of the cars which, when I first started playing the game, I was really impressed to see this car featured. Because although it's not a car that many people would take much notice of, it's one which immediately grabs my attention. Not because it's necessarily a record setter, or even one of my favourite cars. It's not one of my absolute favourites, but at the same time this is one of those cars which I'm always happy to see featured in a game. And part of that is due to nostalgia, and part is due to just a pleasure that I have when games like Project Gotham show this love and respect and give a spotlight to these less obvious choices of car and bike as well in some cases that many games just don't even give a second thought to, and consequently many players just haven't even heard of, especially younger players who haven't been around long enough to know about the car. Now this car was featured on a couple of other games. I believe the first time I saw it was on TOCA Race Driver 3, I think. I don't know if it was featured earlier than that, but that was the first time I was introduced to it. Because in that game there was the Palmer Challenge, and this was one of the cars that you drove, the Jaguar Palmer JP1, which is what the JP1 stands for. And if you're someone who is completely unfamiliar with the Jaguar JP1 or the Palmer Jaguar JP1, you could kind of look at this car as being sort of Jaguar's equivalent to something like an Ariel Atom, or even kind of a Caparo T1, because this car came out before those vehicles, a number of years before in fact, and it's a car which much more closely rides the line between street legal Formula car and actual race car. So it's kind of similar to a Radical as well in that regard, the Radical SR3 and the SR4 in particular, that older generation Radical, a very bare bones, pure track focused approach, which technically speaking you could drive on the road, but not many people do. It tends to be the kind of car that you keep on the track, but at the same time it's much more exclusive, a lot rarer, and kind of more of a unicorn than something like a Radical would be. So with that in mind, what could you actually expect from the car? Because it's not one which a lot of people are familiar with, as we said earlier, so a lot of people would go into it thinking, hey, that's a nice looking car, but who knows if it's going to be any good. After all, Jaguar isn't exactly known for making small, lightweight track day sports cars. In fact, they're not known for that at all. Quite the opposite. Big, heavy luxury cars, which are still fast, but not exactly the nimblest through corners. Well, that's the great thing about this car, because as soon as you get in it, and as soon as you do, say, a lap or two, you immediately get this reassuring feeling that they really knew what they were doing when they made this car. It goes way beyond something like a KTM Crossbow or a Caterham, and it really does feel like a pure race car for the road. It feels, in a similar way to the Radical once again, much more so like a mini LMP car than just a small lightweight sports car, because there is a huge difference. You get some which are genuinely brilliant, and some which are almost just in the club for the sake of selling a few cars to an exclusive market. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but with these ones they certainly have more competition potential, given that that's where their roots are. Now in terms of what they score the car in the game, I actually agree with pretty much all of it. They give it an 8 out of 10 for acceleration, first of all. That puts it just behind a Zonda F in the same category, Category B. And although that may sound a bit steep to be that close to a Zonda F, given that it doesn't have anywhere near that kind of power, that's actually not too far off. And one of the main reasons why is because, unlike many supercars, you can put the power down much more easily in this super lightweight style track car with so much more downforce than many supercars have. Because you've got less power and less torque and less weight, you can just hook up the power, hook up the grip and fly through corners, especially with low end acceleration in particular. Top end, of course, there are plenty of cars that can beat it in this class and even in lower ones. But still, I can see why they gave it an 8. It still seems a little high, but I can agree with that overall, as long as you keep it to low end and mid-range. As far as braking, they give it a 8 again. And yeah, I think I agree with that. The brakes are very powerful. It's a little bit less sure of itself under braking than some other, say, track day cars on the game are. But of course, when you're comparing it to other cars like that, most of the ones at this level or above tend to be just total, all-out, badass, mental machines like the Caparo. So of course, that thing's going to have amazing brakes, whereas this one, It feels good, but it doesn't feel completely sure of itself under braking. It gets a little squirrely sometimes, but of course it's light, it's got downforce, but not as much as some at the same time. It's not a full-on race car, of course. And then as far as grip, they give it a 9. That's a bit generous. I'd say maybe an 8, actually, so that might be the only one that I disagree with, but at the same time I can see why they gave it a 9. And speaking of the Caparo T1, as we were just now, that is one way in which this car really shares something in common with the Caparo, because with the Caparo you have to be going fast to really get good handling, because of how the downforce works, of course. That's how all downforce works. It requires a high-speed airflow to do its job properly, which is why something like a Formula car or a Caparo, by extension, or even this one, will often be much more slippery or even much heavier through corners. Like the Caparo, for instance, in real life, the Caparo T1 has a 95-foot turning circle. That is awful, but if you take that same turning circle at, say, 100 miles per hour, it will turn it better. It won't do a full circle, of course, but the faster you go, the more downforce you have, the better the handling becomes, just like a full-on Formula car, and in a similar way that's what the Jaguar does. Not to the same level, because A, it's not as fast anyway, and B, it doesn't have as much downforce, but it's a similar principle. But instead of being really heavy, with the JP1 it's more so a case of not having quite enough grip, which is why I'd recommend trying to keep your average speed as high as possible through lower and mid-range corners, and rather than braking and accelerating all the time as you would in a typical car, I would recommend trying to use the brakes a little bit less on this one and let it coast a little bit more, because it has the turn in and the sharpness of the steering to allow you to do that, so that you don't need to have this start-stop mentality, even though sometimes you might see me doing that in the video, because of course I play loads of different racing games and getting back into the style of each one isn't always easy. But this is definitely a car which allows you to coast and sometimes even just go full throttle or partial throttle through corners which a normal car simply couldn't, because it has that level of grip. Now, as far as drift, they give it a 4 for that. That's fair enough. You can definitely get the tail out in those lower speed corners because of the lack of airflow for downforce, but it's not too bad. It's fairly easy to control, and because you don't have a huge amount of power, you can tend to correct it before it will run away with itself. And for top end speed, they give it a 5. I'd agree with that. A 5 is reasonable. The top end speed isn't great on this car, which isn't too surprising. It's not designed for that. It's a track day car. It spends most of its time going around, Silverstone, Brands Hatch, tracks which don't really have insane high speed sections. So overall, if you do get a chance to use this car, it is a very good one in the B category. It's not going to destroy everything, of course, but it's a reliable one, and especially on very, very tight city circuits, or technical circuits in general with a lot of square corners and hairpins, that's where this car really comes into its own, and you can quite easily weave through opponents in cars and bikes with potentially a lot more power than you. So it's a useful car for sure, and kind of a unicorn. There are not many games to feature it. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.